emergent trend in American film and television, one might say brings out the worst in art. It is a negation of not only older historical trends in shows and movies, but also of the traditional structure of a narrative itself. It is easy to forget that film and television shows are a young field on the scale of human history. Painting, pottery, sculpture, architecture, song and literature all precede these fields by a remarkable amount of time. Their typically closest comparison is theater, an art form many thousands of years old. For quite some time, and even still among some more traditional academics and critics, film and television have been considered, quote, low art, unquote. They are for the masses, for common people with presumably little to no refined taste. This was the dominant stance among critics and academics for some time, but times change, and with them art. Film analysis is increasingly considered the equal of literary analysis, and often these two disciplines intersect, for a script is a text as much as a story can be a film. However, as much as this is the case, it is also the case that the relation of literature as well as film and television production to the masses, is changing once more, to a state perhaps harmful to the relation of a creator with their audience. To begin with any analysis of this trend, it is first important to note its previous absence. The blurring of the line between film and television can be seen in previous decades with films made for or adapted to a television format. It was not uncommon some time after for one to see a disclaimer at the beginning of a videotape that a production had been formatted to fit a certain screen. YouTuber H. Bomber Guy says in his video upload, The Power of VHS Scanline, under a section entitled Jaws, Texas Chainsaw, and the Art of Not Showing Things, that
when making the film Jaws, which would come to be regarded as the first ever summer blockbuster, Spielberg and co. discovered some problems with the shark prop, a prop many would regard as quite important in a film about a shark that eats people. The animatronics kept breaking down, bits kept falling off of it, and most importantly, it kept sinking. The fake shark had trouble floating in water. Spielberg instead had to rely on using shots of almost everything but the shark to demonstrate the horror of its presence, show the aftermath, show explosions of blood in the distance, show the actors' reactions. The result was a film where you barely ever get to see the animatronic shark, but its presence is felt regardless.
He goes on shortly afterward to say that, in regards to VHS formatting, and in particular to the VHS cut of Ridley Scott's Alien at the time,
if you walked into a room with this playing, you might even think you're watching a scene of something hiding in darkness. I bet you can almost make out a figure hidden there in all the noise. You see where I'm going with this now, don't you? Here's Alien, one of the best, most emotionally intense and scary films ever, on VHS. And through these tapes, Alien was flipping terrifying. I remember being out of my mind scared by this low-res monstrosity. And it wasn't just because of the great acting, directing, editing, creature design, or music. It was because, in all the tensest and darkest moments, you could never really quite be sure what you were looking at. Abstract shapes in the background could almost look like something else. The flickers and noise in the darkness were easily confused for glimpses of the monster. Even when you were sure nothing was there, you could never really be sure.
Viewed in this light, we know more than well the truth of Marshall McLuhan's words, the medium is the message. VHS as a medium imbued horror films with new horrors, crafting an experience with the film distinct from a theater experience. It's easy to see how this concept can be turned around as well for viewers who first experienced this phenomena. It would be quite something to jump back and forth between viewing a VHS film and watching runs of movies on a channel like FX, which at least during my childhood ran a bumper with the hip-hop proclamation that FX has the movies. The film experience of a television viewer could become more personal, sitting on one's own couch watching Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon duel Darth Maul, or watching one of many movie scenes depicting the horrors of Vietnam. In fact, much more could be said of the importing of war films to a home setting, but the larger point remains in regards to the audience's familiarity with a film on television or a television show captured on a VHS tape, like a film-personalized engagement with the art, like the translation of the Bible from Latin to the language of the masses. The evolution of this phenomenon over time is self-evident. The Haunting of Bly Manor released this year on Netflix and utilizes many of the same techniques more intentionally. To this effect, figures can be seen in the shadows and terrible ghosts can be imagined, but some things are too clear to be compared directly to Alien on VHS. Still, Netflix as a format allows for television shows to be consumed like extended films, such that the content of a single episode blurs into the next. In many ways, the film has become television and television has become film. Even while this has occurred, continuing as television and theaters have tried to compete more and more with streaming services, another dynamic has also taken root, ranging from the 1990s all the way to the present day, 20 or 30 years later. Some years ago, an article from Observer popped up and said as follows. Around the late 90s, shows like The X-Files and Buffy the Vampire Slayer ushered in an era of fandom. Viewers were empowered by the internet and its burgeoning fandom communities. Note that the people who were early adopters to message boards and listservs had a certain bias in what they favored, geeky, cerebral shows that rewarded vigilant and recurring viewings. Think Twin Peaks. Think, later, and for another generation, Lost. Think what we've come to understand as the new golden age of television, co-created equally by its writers and its most passionate fans. This turned out to be somewhat prophetic. While Grant argued that the trend was inclined away from creators and writers and towards artists paving their own way in spite of the fans, we have since seen high-profile case studies alluding to the possibility that the opposite may be true. His observation in particular that Netflix's House of Cards is not beholden to the public holds, in hindsight, a great deal of irony, given that some short years later the lead, Kevin Spacey, was outed as a pedophile and pressure to take him off the show mounted. Grant makes a partially astute observation when he says, today the internet is full of such superfans, and sites like Tumblr make it easy to share fan art and fiction about favorite characters, but he makes a critical error in his observations. Grant correctly identifies a fan mindset, an obsession with creating content inspired by a show, but regards this behavior in terms of related art such as fan fiction or fan art. Instead of remarking on the place of Tumblr in fan-related content, it may be more relevant to move our sites to Reddit. Both websites have, or in the case of Tumblr had, large communities dedicated to everything from politics to biology. However, we can easily see that they vary structurally. Tumblr posts, if they received comments and responses from Tumblr users, presented themselves vertically, and unless one searched through the disparate comments in the notes section, one could only view the post as a single conversation, with different posters responding to each other in only a single comment thread. Not so with Reddit. A Reddit post would have a single post with different comments one might scroll through at leisure, and each reply to each comment would open up its own immediately accessible comment chain, all capable of being viewed alongside each other on the same page. In some ways, this made Reddit a more fertile ground for interrogative discussion. The practice of creating fan theories is difficult to trace back in time. When did people begin meeting or publishing work in any capacity that speculated on the qualities of another work of art? This is a difficult question to answer, but it can easily be observed that the practice of uniting to speculate about the implications of a story has existed in more or less the way that it does now for about as long as internet discussion forums and chat rooms have themselves existed. A fan theory could be thought of as a kind of evidence-based hypothesis that ruminates on things such as the plot or themes of a work of art. We must keep these two components of fan theory in mind. We must burn them, sear them into our brains if we are truly to understand the impact of the fan theory on our culture. When assessing the impact of something like a fan theory on a work, in any diagnosis we must eventually move from a question of if and why is this certain something occurring to the question of should this be occurring. Grant acknowledges this when he says, the program Sherlock famously altered story in response to fans. It spent the first episode of its 4th season mocking online shipping culture, the desire of fans to see two characters develop a romantic relationship. This was the case with Holmes and Watson. The show also infamously featured a villain, Moriarty, who used an intonation with uptalk known as gay voice to flirtatiously provoke Holmes. The creator also famously cited the justification for this element of characterization as being that it made the character seem more unhinged. The fans, of course, seized on this immediately. For their part, the showrunner and writer's decision to add content to the show, even acknowledging the wants of the fans, is itself a symptom of something. This kind of interplay between fan and creator is not outside the norm, but it appears to have become increasingly violent in modern media. Madison Smart Bell, in his book Narrative Design, Working with Imagination, Craft, and Form, writes, "But plot and suspense are the instruments with which the reader is led, by the nose if you like, across the passage of time that the narrative requires to take place." Bell also remarks that suspense is vital to hold a reader's attention, and that plot, suspense, causality, and time are inextricably intertwined in linear narratives especially. In linear design, the story overall has a triangular arc, with the bottom line representing the broad distance between exposition and denouement, and the top lines representing the rising action to climax to falling action. This, of course, presupposes events occurring in chronological order. This may not be wholly consistent with the flashback, often symptomatic of a heavy-handed attempt to inform a reader, but not always so. However, even in that case, the larger arc of the story displays a beginning and end. In a Netflix series, this is both the general shape of the entire series as well as the general shape of each episode. Grant was right in asserting that the simultaneous release of an entire series or season gives less time for audience creator feedback, but this format has not exclusively dominated modern media. As Bell asserts, it is the case that in the design of a narrative, the plot is a function of time within the story, and this speaks to a need to spend different amounts of text examining different periods of time and different levels of detail. This is also the case for the engagement of the audience and fans. A viewer experiences a show over time, perhaps spending more or less time between any number of episodes than one would assume, like regularly picking up a book or magazine and putting it down upon leaving the bathroom. This view of viewer engagement can be carried over to the arc spent between seasons, even over years. All things in time. It may be possible that the greater the stretch of time, the greater the suspense, but this is difficult to confirm. Game of Thrones, and you knew we were going to get here eventually, folks. A televised adaptation of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire first aired in the spring of 2011 and concluded in the spring of 2019. Every year the show had a single season air for a total of 8 seasons. I was home with the flu in high school when I first watched the entire first season of Game of Thrones, so I remember it well. I hadn't heard anybody else talk about it, but was aware it had a medieval fantasy setting from exploring its description on my parents' cable network's streaming service. Netflix and its parallel video streaming services had yet to take off in popularity to the degree that they would in the following years. For the time being, I enjoyed Game of Thrones privately, recommending it to my friends and family and being received with the kind of skepticism that usually accompanied my geeky fantasy recommendations. Game of Thrones would go on to be one of the most significant shows in American television culture during its run, all the way up to its immediate drop-off in popularity following its final season. Each episode in the finale deviated more and more from the viewer's expectations of the finale. There was an expected plot of the show where a lead character, Jon Snow, or another lead, Daenerys Targaryen, would assume the throne. Thematically, the many episodes leading up to that point slowly built to a thematic understanding among the viewers that Jon Snow was fit for the throne. Both his and Daenerys' arc of personal development in the show made them out to be strong but empathetic protagonists. Jon put to death traitors of the Night's Watch, but felt compassion for the wildlings he fought against and showed them mercy, while Daenerys executed slavers but did her best to liberate slaves. In a certain sense, they're both primed to take the throne as a just king or queen, the ideal of which is itself a fantastical trope of medieval fantasy literature. On the website Reddit, a culture of fan theories had taken hold of discussions of shows and games like Game of Thrones or Dark Souls. The story of Dark Souls is told sporadically through environments, small cutscenes, and item descriptions. A player knows so little about the world that the little discovery itself becomes the story. One enters a large room in a cathedral and is confronted by 2 strong knights. Upon defeating the knights, a sentence or two about them can be viewed if one chooses to look at their armor. In a sense, this information is not relevant to the character because the experience of exploration and struggle is itself the story. The backstory of the remnants of a dying world are of secondary concern. Eiichiro Oda, author of the long-running fantasy manga series One Piece, is rumored to have consulted with fan sites to remind himself of some of the details of his own work's story that he may forget. The popular Wikipedia offshoot fan site Wikipedia functions as a database for all lore of all Star Wars material, from films to television series to books to comics and so on. Slowly, in fan culture, there has been a growing emphasis on collecting information in order to determine exactly what is going on in a series and to further understand its world. While it is clearly not the only site where this behavior is exhibited by the fans, subreddit pages or forums within Reddit dedicated to specific topics have become hotbeds of fan theory and speculation. Using these sites, fans of Game of Thrones began postulating and circulating hypotheses as to the nature of the world of Song of Ice and Fire and the future of its story. The first hint to the public that something might have gone wrong with the writing and/or production of Game of Thrones came via brief interviews with the original author, George R.R. Martin, as well as some of the people who worked on the show. When asked if the next 2 and final installments in A Song of Ice and Fire would follow the plot of the show Game of Thrones, Martin answered, well, yes and no, and yes and no, and yes and no, and yes. In a comment to Rolling Stone, he also said, would I prefer Benioff and Weiss do it exactly the way I did it? Sure. It's 2 variations of the same story, or a similar story, and you get that whenever anything is adapted. Martin seemed to have made his peace with the creative differences between himself and Benioff and Weiss, noting that he would have prepared the show to go on at least 10 seasons, while they would have preferred 7. The compromise of 8 seasons seemed to temper their creative differences with practical limitations. Martin had more books and shows to write, and so did Benioff and Weiss. Speculation of controversy surrounded Benioff and Weiss's future career together. The duo had a deal to make Confederate, an alternate history speculating on an America where the South won the American Civil War, but left that production allegedly to work on a Star Wars trilogy Disney had offered them. Yet this plan too soured, and Benioff and Weiss pivoted a second time to a deal with Netflix. The future of that production is unknown, and due to the duo either losing these deals or opting out of them at the same time as fans and critics were becoming more and more critical of Game of Thrones, the timing caused ripples on the internet. Had Benioff and Weiss really done so poorly that they had fallen out of favor with not only HBO but Disney as well? There was tension to these discussions, but no clear indicator of what the truth might be. One thing was for certain. Publicly, Martin clearly seemed more troubled by sites like Reddit than by Benioff and Weiss. In a 2015 interview with Michelle Fairley of Wheeler Center, Martin was asked if he was surprised at all the various online theories regarding his work, and in response he said,
You know, I did once upon a time, a long time ago, but I've given up doing that. Actually, the internet Ice and Fire community, Game of Thrones community, of course, has grown hugely over the years, just like the series has. It actually began right here in Australia. The very first website ever devoted to the series was started by a guy named Peter Gibbs, who was called Dragonstone, and it was based here in Australia. And it was the first bulletin board where people would post their theories and discuss them and talk about who was the favorite character or who would win in a sword fight or, you know, what secrets they thought I was hiding or not hiding. And when that occurred, and now we're going back to, I think, around 1998, 99, that this Dragonstone started. I did look at it. I was very flattered to have a website entirely devoted to fans discussing not fantasy in general and not science fiction in general, but specifically the series that I was working on. And I read some of the discussions, but then it rapidly dawned on me, you know, I should not be doing this. Okay. For one thing, I don't want to actually post there, because the minute I post there, the free discussion among fans who are all more or less equal ends, and it becomes instead everybody gather around the author and ask him questions, and that's a distortion of what the format should be. I didn't want to do that. And the other thing is, yeah, some of the theories were incredibly wrong-headed and amusing in that sense. Some of them were clever, and maybe I hadn't thought of them, but now I'm saying, that would be a good idea.
Have you done that?
No, I don't want to do that either, because then, then I'm like taking ideas from the fan. I don't want to. I want this to be my own ideas. And then the other one was, of course, I have certain things that I'm laying clues for, that there'll be revelations later on. Some people had put together those clues even as early as 1998 and are adding things together. I said, well, what do I do with that? What do I do with that? These people have guessed the secret that I'm going to reveal in book 6. People have already guessed that here, and book 2 is just out. You really have two choices there. You can ignore it and proceed with your plan, despite the fact that some people know where you're going. Or you can get all panicky and say, oh my God, they figured it out. I can't let that be. I'll have to change it. I'll have to go in a different direction. And I think some writers do that. And I think that's always a mistake.
Yeah.
If you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet, someone has figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change in midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book, because you get this foreshadowing early on, and you've got these little clues you planted. Now they're dead ends, and you have to introduce other clues, and you're retconning. It's a mess. So I decided as early as Dragonstone's heyday, and I think that site had gone away by 2000 or so, that I would stay off the fan sites and let those be for the fans, let those be for the readers, let them argue their theories, whether they're right, whether they're wrong, but I don't need to know about that.
Clearly, Martin felt some inner conflict about the relationship between his work as a writer and the writings of his fans about his work. If this is representative of Martin's stance on the matter, one must then wonder at Benioff and Weiss's motivations for so drastically changing the direction of the show for the purpose of giving it a twist ending. In seasons 1 through 5, even into seasons 6 and 7, the story positions John as the greatest candidate for the throne. John becomes worldly, wise, compassionate, and hardened. His royal lineage is slowly revealed. Yet in the final season, John kills Daenerys in a sudden twist. The fall of Daenerys is at least somewhat foreshadowed. In some scenes, she is competent and bold. In others, she is idealistic and power-hungry. That Varys and Tyrion, who were some of her most staunch supporters, would plot suddenly against her, and Jon would kill her and subsequently be relegated to the fringes of society, was worked into the plot seemingly without consideration for the greater themes of the story or the massive amount of work spent setting the story up so the audience could know, in Martin's words, that the butler did it. Following the backlash to this ill-received ending, Benioff and Weiss stayed out of the public eye for some time, going so far as to cancel their Comic-Con appearance only 2 days before the date they were scheduled to appear on a panel. Fans were outraged, going so far as to sign a petition to redo the entire ending, a petition that would get over 1 million signatures. Even the actors began to express that they wanted better endings for their characters who seemed to be one kind of person in one season and a totally different person the next season, i.e., Daenerys' comment, "I will not be Queen of the Ashes" in season 1, and burning the capital city to ashes in the next. Characters who, for the benefit of the viewer, openly spoke about the thing they knew, and then went on to act as if they had never had those conversations, i.e., Daenerys being briefed on the status of the enemy fleet, and subsequently forgetting about it later on. While characters as believable representations of humans need not be rational, the story in this case seemingly ought to be. It appeared as though Benioff and Weiss had torpedoed their public goodwill and reputation in the industry, and to what end? Martin had seeded Game of Thrones with the plans of A Song of Ice and Fire, but the resulting ending was entirely different. Of Benioff and Weiss, he said, "Know certain things. I've told them certain things. So they have knowledge, but the devil is in the details." On the surface, Martin appeared to be making the point that he had given Benioff and Weiss the broad strokes, but not the specific lines from which to draw a conclusion for the series. Benioff and Weiss knew how Martin's story ends. Martin thinks he knows too. The fans think they know. Martin refuses to change the ending based on what the fans know, and has not, by all signs, told Benioff and Weiss that they should change the ending for that reason. Yet the ending isn't exactly what Martin had in mind. 2 sets of writers working through 2 different mediums ensured the result would be different. Martin, for his part, refuses to throw Benioff and Weiss under the bus by at all suggesting that the ending deviated greatly from what he had planned. Talented and acclaimed writer Stephen King had an alternative view on plot when contrasted with Bell's. Mainly, quote, "I distrust plot for two reasons. Firstly, because our lives are largely plotless, even when you add in all our reasonable precautions and careful planning. And second, because I believe plotting and the spontaneity of real creation aren't compatible." He further states, "In some instances, the outcome is what I visualized. In most, however, it's something I never expected. For a suspense novelist, this is a great thing. I am, after all, not just the novel's creator, but its first reader. And if I'm not able to guess with any accuracy how the damn thing is going to turn out, even with my inside knowledge of coming events, I can be pretty sure of keeping the reader in a state of page-turning anxiety. And why worry about the ending anyway? Why be such a control freak?" Benioff and Weiss had a destination but not a map. In truth, maybe it was never possible for them to have a map. Martin seems to take that position in regards to his own writing. Maybe another ending will find its way to Martin while he's crossing that uncharted terrain. But one thing seems for sure now. Benioff and Weiss didn't need a better destination, because the ending doesn't write the story brings out the ending. This appears at first to be something of an internal contradiction. In a series of videos titled Let's Gripe About Writing, YouTuber, artist, and animator Plague of Gripes approaches the topic of how exactly to write successfully in 3 parts. The first part of this series, in particular, reinforces this exact notion. Plague states the following.
Step 2 in our writing process is a solid foundation. Generally, any story comes from some idea. Either you had a great character in your head you wanted to build a story around, a great history you wanted characters to support, a life experience you wanted to turn into a story, and so on. There are an infinite number of things to build on, but you need to build on something that you actually love or have an intense interest in. It has to be a strong enough foundation to keep you at least halfway invested in the writing process, to the point that the actual story will start to take over later on. In my own experience, and from what I've certainly always heard from authors, about a quarter or halfway into a story you end up realizing what it's going to be about. You almost never really know when you start. Like I've said in my art videos, never commit to anything, because it will and should change. Rigidity is death.
The watchword in narrative design then must certainly be fluidity or flexibility. King, for his part, uses a metaphor of plot and narrative being to a writer as a fossil is to a paleontologist. The crux of this metaphor is that there is a degree of meeting with the unknown when plotting. If plotting is done mostly during the process of writing as opposed to prior to that process, then there's a degree of blind excavation. King further compares plotting to taking a jackhammer to the dig site, further stating, "It's clumsy, mechanical, anti-creative. Plot, I think, is the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first resort." The easy observation from this insight is that, somewhat ironically, given popular assertions by fans that they didn't know how to end Game of Thrones or weren't well versed enough in the material of A Song of Ice and Fire, Benioff and Weiss may have plotted too much. Fans were taken aback to the point of being insulted by the story Benioff and Weiss made, and despite their claims that the showrunners could have simply known more about the story and done a better job with it, a claim Martin appears to contest, what fans may have truly felt was a lack of respect and engagement. Plague of Gripes remarks on this as well as anyone has.
The more you respect your audience, the more you enable them to invest themselves emotionally and intellectually in your product. And as a result, they will assign more and more of their own personal revelations to the story. The genius of this sort of thing is that people will take the things they care the most about and then find those traits in your narrative, even if they never intended for them to be there in the first place. It's the cooperative nature of storytelling, the ability to understand one another by drawing upon a shared experience. That's the true strength of all writing.
The final couple of seasons of Game of Thrones were, quite simply, not the story the viewers wanted or expected. Benioff and Weiss knew more or less exactly how the story was meant to end. It is self-evident that Benioff and Weiss did not achieve any cooperation between themselves and the dissatisfied fans. Stephen King says of this dynamic that the writer should have an ideal reader, or person and audience who the writer specifically writes to please, further stating, ideal reader is also the best way for you to gauge whether or not your story is paced correctly, and if you've handled the backstory in a satisfactory fashion. A writer does not have merely an audience to please. The resulting symbiotic relationship between audience and artist also tests the bones of the story, the overall structure of the thing. A large number of works of art, often artlessly, communicate that when traveling, what matters isn't the destination but rather the journey. This applies equally as much in a figurative sense as a literal one. In writing, this dynamic is inverted. A story is all about its destination precisely because it is about the journey. The metaphor breaks down rather quickly. This is not a reflexive truth. Ideally, the process guides the plot and not the other way around. The process creates the product, no matter how hard suspense tempts one to jump to the conclusion. If plotting is ideally not the process, then a Wikipedia-style website, or the Game of Thrones equivalent in a wiki of Ice and Fire, is merely lore. Lore is as much plot as myth, a story about a story. This compulsion to create a compendium of a work of art may bring its audience exactly the kind of story Benioff and Weiss brought their audience, a story built on broad strokes. It's nice to know what happens, but there's a deeper art being discarded. A healthy relationship between the artist and audience will never develop out of that dynamic. The audience has, to a certain extent, chosen plot over story. Ray Bradbury, in Zen and the Art of Writing, produces a variant on an Oscar Wilde poem saying, "Art will fly if held too lightly. Art will die if held too tightly. Lightly, tightly, how do I know whether I'm holding or letting art go?" Bradbury is speaking on how to hold and keep a muse, and perhaps in these words we can find a commentary on suspense, or the need to know. We think we want to know how the story ends, and in holding to a plot so tightly, we kill our art. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. I appreciate you listening to me talk about this dumb show once again. I'm pretty sure this will be the last time, so don't worry about it. I wanted to do this because I noticed that there were like 2 or 3 types of critiques of Game of Thrones on here. One was kind of like a production critique where people tend to mash up things that Martin or Benioff and Weiss or different actors said about the show, their reactions to the material, or another is when people tend to cut different segments of the show, so that, for example, there's like a scene where Dany is planning out where the Iron Fleet is, and then it cuts to one of the showrunners saying Dany forgot about the Iron Fleet, which is obviously ridiculous. But the other sort of, in general terms, type of critique of Game of Thrones that I see on here is people talking about the politics of the show. And I've been perfectly willing to do that, but I wanted to do something about writing and art, because I think that a lot of people on here don't really know much about writing. Beyond, like, just really simple stuff they pick up online. And I kind of wanted to bring some of my education and my career and degree into this. As a fantasy author, as someone who studied literature and creative writing, and as someone who is able to source, obviously, some material to, like, people who have written about narrative design and stuff like that, and other famous authors. I say other famous authors. I'm not a famous author, obviously. That would be really self-aggrandizing. But if you liked this video, then, do the whole comment, subscribe thing. I appreciate it. And until next time, bye-bye.